Okay, so this is part of a series I wanted to do to help people with what information you can have that kind of supports ideas about constitutional values and why they're so important, as well as other things about history and government and how things should be. And you can't get this information in the schools anymore. Schools, when I was a kid, schools were really good. And that was a long, long time ago. It's been many decades since I've been a kid. I'm not no longer young. I'm actually old now. When I was a kid, a lot of the stuff that people are learning about the history of the country didn't really. It got moved to where the kids are lucky if they even get any of it in junior high or high school. And that's one of the issues. But there's others where they're getting fed garbage, and for lack of better terms, people from Europe are influencing how the educational system in North America and the US should be changed to their liking. So you have all these elitism ideas that have infected the US public schools, as well as they've also changed the perspective in Europe and other places in the world also. People are seeing a perversion of ideas. They're not seeing what it really should be, and they're not seeing the consequences of what there's real consequences of having bad government compared to good government. Well, what is good government? Good government is based on liberties, ideals, and freedom and faith. You can't leave out morality. The problem is if you no longer have some kind of morality guiding anything, then it goes it goes south on you and you lose control and it becomes lawlessness or anarchy or it changes forms to other tyrantisms. See, tyrantism is held in check by ethics, values, virtue, and faith. So even if you're not religious, you still benefit from having a religious society. And the irony of this is that people who are seeing how messed up the country is now, they who are often wealthy and powerful are wishing people would, as a population, would get back to being Christian values because they're starting to see that a society without Christian values or moral values of some kind becomes extremely turbulent. So, do you want a turbulent society or do you want a peaceful society? That's the choice. To get there, you need to understand how liberty works and free speech and other liberties as they are illustrated in the Constitution and constitutional values and the things that created this country as well as what created the Declaration of Independence. Now, to give you an idea, to lead off into this, I'm going to give you an idea of what is not constitutional values and how bad it was. Okay, here is a brief summary of the major power struggles and wars in Europe in the 1800s. First, you have the Napoleonic Wars. It didn't end quickly. The Napoleonic Wars uh, basically took place from 1803 to 1815. It also brought in all of the major world powers, and all of them were drawn into this war. That include Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Eventually, led to the defeat and removal of Napoleon, and it also changed the world powers map in Europe. But before he could get removed, many people's lives were ruined. That's families. The men were killed. Tons of people were killed from Napoleon. Okay? Not even 6 years later, you have the Greek War of Independence. Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1832. And that was basically the Greeks rebelling against and throwing off the yoke of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, the Ottoman Empire was a major world power. It began losing its strength in the early 1800s. They eventually started calling it the sick man of Europe, and that term persisted especially around the time of War One, World War One, and before World War One. They were not the only ones to throw off the rule of the Ottoman Empire. Historically, Austria, this is kind of a side tangent, and I won't go into it in detail now. We'll get into it later, but Austria and the Siege of Vienna had a role in stopping the advance of the Ottoman Empire into Europe several centuries before the Greek independence. Basically, the Ottoman Empire, they had been powerful. They were basically a caliphate, and it was anti-freedom. But they weren't the only ones that were anti-freedom. Basically, if you have a king, if you have kingmen or things resembling a king, you do not have any rights. You are fodder. Okay, when there's a war, they could go through a town and just start pushing people into service. Didn't matter if you had a family or kids to take care of. They didn't care about stealing all of your food. If the army was coming through your town, people don't really talk about that. These wars in Europe, guess where the wars were taking place? They would have them out in the fields. Okay, so that's your field. Now your family's going to starve and you have no income. And, they'd fight these battles in the hills. And what do you think would happen to all the food in these towns when the army for these warring kings would be caught in a town? Okay, they would requisition supplies. What do you think that means? Okay, these people don't have a lot. They don't have a middle class in Europe. Even now, the middle class idea and concept in Europe is more of an illusion than a reality, and people have been blinded by that, by a sophisticated use of technology, being with technology masking and giving an illusion of a middle class. And a middle class is extremely important for a country to have freedom, or whether or not it doesn't have freedom, because it represents the idea that everyone in society is participating or can participate. Okay, if you have a king, if you have a kingdom or kingmen or people that even live like kings, they're the only ones that have the voice in the government. The common people do not, especially the poor. And people are starting to realize that in many countries now, what they perceive as their middle class, or what's left of it, has an illusion that they have a say in what happens in their country. And they're starting to see that they really don't, and that they've been lied to. They're being lied to, cheated, and tricked. See? And this is why the idea of kings is so harmful to society. Elitism is the same as having a king. It's just having littler kings or more than one king. Elitism, globalism, the idea of having a king, it doesn't work. It's bad for families. It's bad for a middle class. It's bad for the poor. Okay, continuing on with our list. We just mentioned the Napoleonic Wars. Barely 6 years later, you had the Greek War of Independence, lasted until 1832. The Crimean War from 1853 to 1856, which was a conflict between Russia and the alliance of the Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, and Sardinia, triggered by disputes, etc. I want to say more on that. I'm going to come back to that. But oftentimes when you read these history books, they'll tell you the reason for the war. Well, it's kind of a lie. What they gave you is the facts on why the war started, but the real reasoning for the war is the people at the top are extremely greedy and they look at other things that don't belong to them and they want them. That's what causes the war, as well as racial hatred and religious hatred. Religious hatred, it sometimes gets blamed for what the kings are fighting over. The kings want to build a kingdom. They want more power. Okay, that's not usually religion causing the war. So many Europeans have decided they want to be atheist, so they'll avoid wars or avoid, violence by becoming atheist. And that's not true because it's not actually religion that usually causes the war. Although, if a religion is masking as, say, if it's masking as a religion when it's actually a form of warlordism, okay, there's a certain religion in the East, in the Middle East, that masks as a religion, but it's warlordism, okay, that's different. But by and large, a lot of the European wars were actually caused by the kings, the coveting of wealth, wanting more lands, and to become powerful. Everyone wanted to be the next Charlemagne. You see, for over 1,000 years, these European kingdoms and their kings, they would look at this example of Charlemagne and how powerful he was and how he basically took over everything and he was unstoppable and he created the largest kingdom in Europe outside of the Roman Empire, pretty much. Well, not including Russia, but a lot of Russia is too cold to have much fighting over. So anyway, the idea of Charlemagne and his empire spanning half of Europe, it's inspired all these people to want to be, you know, powerful kings and want all this territory. Okay, they see Charlemagne and they're like, I want to be powerful like him. And even in Britain, they emulate the Black Prince. The Black Prince was the chief general that basically pillaged, raped, and murdered all over the French countryside during the French and English Hundred Years' War. That is not a person to emulate. And a lot of you will sometimes hear certain people in Britain emulating him. British people are nice, so I'm not against them. So sorry if you heard this, but it's a fact that people should be aware of. Okay, back to before, going back into the list. The War of the Italian Unification took place between 1848 and 1870. That is a really long time. That's, 22 years of war, of basically civil war, of Italy trying to unite itself. Then you had the Austro-Prussian War, 1866, and the Prussians were very much a world player, a world power up until up until you know they disappeared. Eventually, Prussia became Germany, but Prussia was everybody wanted their army and military to be like Prussia, principally because of King Frederick the Great. I will talk more about Prussia later, but basically, there was a massive war over the unification of Germany. Um, and that's also sort of a more of a political conflict in some ways, and you could describe it different ways. But you had the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871. You had the Balkan Wars after the turn of the century. That's all I'll go into for now. I'm going to post more on this. But, okay, if you look at the table of all of these wars, every time you have one, everybody's drawn into it. The neighbors are drawn into it too. Even if they're not stated, their borders are overwhelmed with refugees. They're put under stress from resources of people coming in that are fleeing the war. and then having to worry about your border. And every time you have these conflicts, these elitists, the kingmen, they are looking for how they can get a piece of the pie. And who is going to suffer for that? The people who are under them. And this is why when you look at this table, there's wars all over Europe, probably every couple of years. And you can look at this at other time periods. This is just the 1800s, but I'm going to show you a pattern later that the others, the other centuries have as many wars or as more. And this pattern needs to be shown to people to help them understand their history, because when you see this, you can see how much misery is created by the lack of a constitution, lack of freedom, lack of faith. Also, the kings did not allow free thinking faith in churches. They didn't like it. And that was why you had trouble translating the Bible so much. Just about every century since the Anglo-Saxon era in England had some form of an attempt to translate and organize and put together a Bible manuscript. In most of those centuries, war, pillaging, political problems stopped that for a very long time. So it's not a good thing. Now, in conclusion, there's a quote by George Washington. Okay, George Washington advised the people in the United States in the early era to not be involved with the kings of Europe and the other kingdoms, to not be involved in foreign affairs. This is why the coveting of the kings, the political machinations, none of this is good. It's not good for families, and it can suck you in because they infect the elites in a country of wanting to be with like them and how much they could personally profit. And it brings misery to the country. This is why there needs to be a return to constitutional values and faith. Faith holds it all together. It's the glue. Without any glue, bricks can be pushed out of a wall without cement.